Good evening and welcome, everyone, to the lecture tonight. It's the inaugural lecture for the Monrad Chair in Christian Studies. The chair is the generous gift of Ernest E. Monrad, A.B. 1951, and Elizabeth H. Monrad, who established an endowed chair here at the Divinity School to be known as the Elizabeth H. Monrad Professorship of Christian Studies. Their goal with this gift was to further the study of Christianity in its multiple manifestations and to cultivate an understanding of Christianity as a global and international religious tradition. And it is a most welcome gift and augmentation of our teaching capacity, particularly in Christian studies. Betty and Ernie Monrad, our donors, are well known to many of us here. I don't think I need to even introduce them, though they're sitting up in the fourth row. They're so well known. But they have, as you know, been tireless supporters of Harvard University in general and of this school as well as the college in particular. And as far as HDS is concerned, I would just remind you that their service here has been really, I think, significant over the last 20 years or so. Betty has been a member of the Ministerial Studies Advisory Committee and the Visiting Committee here to the Divinity School. And through the Elizabeth H. Monrad Scholarship Fund, she has provided financial support and guidance to numerous HDS students over the years. And I know that many of them not only meet with her when they're here studying on a Monrad scholarship, but they also stay in touch with her afterwards. Ernie was chair of the last Divinity School campaign, working with Ron Thiemann, who I think persuaded him to take this on. And that's a job that I guess one wouldn't wish on anyone, except someone who is tireless and very well connected. And I think Ernie is both of those things. Ernie's also served as chair of the Dean's Council and remains an active member of that, something for which I certainly have been extremely grateful over the last 4 years. The generosity and dedication of both Ernie and Betty, I think, have made a tremendous difference in the lives of countless students here, as well as to the school as a whole. They have helped to shape this school in many ways as we know it today, and I think not least with the gift of this professorship that we celebrate this evening. So on behalf of the entire community, Betty, Ernie, I want to thank you both for your generosity with your time and your resources and for everything that you've done for us, and most of all, for this very special chair, which we have been fortunate enough to fill with a very special scholar. And to introduce her, I'm going to turn to my colleague and ask Stephanie Paulsell, who is our professor of ministry studies here, if she would please introduce our speaker. Stephanie.
Good afternoon. It is my very great pleasure to introduce Professor Amy Hollywood, the new Elizabeth Monrad Professor of Christian Studies at Harvard Divinity School. Amy comes to us most recently from the University of Chicago Divinity School, where she served as Professor of Theology and the History of Christianity. She has also taught in the religion departments of Dartmouth College and Rhodes College and has held visiting appointments at Grinnell College and Syracuse University. She has been a cherished teacher in all of these places, and indeed in only her second semester of teaching at HDS, she has been voted by our students as the Outstanding Teacher of the Year. Amy Hollywood is well known for scholarship at the intersection of Christian mysticism, feminist theory, psychoanalysis, and philosophy. Her first book, the wonderfully titled The Soul as Virgin Wife, Mechtilde of Magdeburg, Marguerite Porete, and Meister Eckhart, won the Otto Grundler Prize for the best book in medieval studies in 1997. Robert Lerner, a medievalist not given to hyperbole in his book reviews, called it, to say the least, a marguerite, a pearl, a marvel from start to finish. And indeed it is, exploring the desire of medieval male hagiographers to seek redemption in the suffering of women's bodies and the ways in which Mechtilde, Porete, and Eckhart resisted this vision in their intersecting negotiations of pain and imagination and the work of the soul. Amy's second book, Sensible Ecstasy, Mysticism, Sexual Difference, and the Demands of History, is no less a pearl and explores how 20th century French intellectuals such as Georges Bataille, Simone de Beauvoir, Jacques Lacan, and Luce Irigaray looked to Christian women's mysticism as a way of thinking about subjectivity, the body, and sexual difference. Sensible Ecstasy is a contribution to the study of medieval women's mysticism, to the history of philosophy, and to feminist theory. Reading it, Judith Butler found Amy Hollywood's conceptual acuity and erudition in Sensible Ecstasy phenomenal. I read her, Butler says, not only with great pleasure, but with the sure expectation that I will be productively transformed by what she has to say. Students in the audience will know what I mean when I say that when one is in school preparing for a life of teaching and scholarship, one often develops a lively fantasy life about the ideal job. Sometimes these fantasies revolve around particular schools or places in the world one would like to live. But most often, I think, our fantasies about the ideal job revolve around the hope that we will find among our colleagues the kind of friends who inspire us to do our very best work. Friends who challenge us and comfort us. Friends who will hand us the right book at the right time and read our work and help us make it better. I first met Amy Hollywood 20 years ago this fall in a seminar on feminist theology. And I've known ever since that in my ideal job, her office would be just down the hall from mine. I got so lucky, and so did we all. Please welcome Amy Hollywood.
I'm going to cry before I start my talk, and the talk's not going to help. The name of my lecture today is Acute Melancholia, but before melancholy, gratitude. First, to Elizabeth and Ernest Monrad for their enormous generosity to Harvard Divinity School, to Harvard University, and today in particular to Harvard Divinity School. It's a great honor for me to hold the Elizabeth H. Monrad Chair in Christian Studies, and I hope I can do so in ways that at least partially reflect the grace and generosity of the chair's namesake and of its joint donors. I'm very happy today to be speaking to them and to some of their family, as well as to all of you. My gratitude to Bill Graham, Dean of the Divinity School, is enormous, both for his professional confidence in me, his patience, I should also add, and for his persistent and inspiring vision of what Harvard Divinity School is and can be. For that, I think we all thank him. It's wonderful to be here, down the hall from Stephanie Pausell. And for that, I thank my colleagues, the faculty, administration, staff, and students of Harvard Divinity School. And finally, for helping me think through this particular bit of work that I'm going to present to you today, which was fraught with endless phone calls and conversation. I want to give special thanks to Constance Fury, to Stephanie Pausell, and to my friend in New Hampshire who couldn't be here, Melissa Zeiger. My topic today is perhaps sadder than is fitting for a happy occasion, the celebration of a new institutional space for scholarship, for thought, and for teaching. But I wanted to present to you in this inaugural moment a piece of my current work, and that work is, for reasons that will emerge as I speak, about the implacability of grief and our inability ever fully to let go of those we love. It's also about how, if we are lucky, the others we refuse to lose enable us to live. As an exiled, old, ailing Sigmund Freud wrote to the poet H.D., she and her daughter Perdita had just sent him a flowering plant for his 80th birthday. Quote, "Life is not easy, but spring is beautiful, and so is love." End quote. Without love, there is no grief. And I'll suggest today that perhaps, and I'm following here Freud and a host of others much wiser than myself, without grief, or at least the possibility of grief, there is no love. Okay, no one in my family can tell a story without telling 25 stories. Reed, my husband, will attest to this. Not just because one story inevitably leads to another. It's not just the chain reaction. But also because any given story is embedded with endless digressions, only seemingly incidental anecdotes, all wending their way toward some grand narrative finale that usually never arrives. Oops. Oh, this is my mother's necklace, and there she goes. Thanks, Mom. Yeah, it's very helpful. As my students, some of you who are here know, this is how I tend to teach, with things falling off also. I'm going to give you today the gift of a short version, the abbreviated, non-digressive version of the story of my paternal great-grandmother, Mariah Hollywood. The gift part is that it's going to be short. I'm not sure that the story itself is a gift. It was incredibly hard for me to do this, and that's why the first part of this lecture is written out, because it's the only way I could get myself not to digress, but I'm already doing it, see? My mother is the one who told the story, one she had from my grandpa Hollywood. His mother, after whom I was unwittingly named, first omitted long digression, and that's the last time I'm going to point to them. My great-grandmother starved herself to death. She lived in Lower Manhattan. Her bartender husband, my great-grandfather, the inevitably named Patrick Hollywood, died young, leaving her with the remaining of their 8 children. My grandfather, Joseph, graduated from the 6th grade just after his father died, left school, and went to work to support his mother and younger brothers and sisters. First, he sold papers, at the same time running errands for the various salesmen who came in and out of the paper's production offices. He became interested in chemistry through talking to these men. He taught himself a few things about chemistry and eventually went to work for a chemical salesman tied to the newspapers. Over time, he went to work for himself and made a decent amount of money, all of which rapidly dissipated after his death, but that's another story. All of this happened later. Through his 20s, he shared an apartment with his mother and one remaining sister until, at the age of 16, that last sister, Mary, died. And when Mary died, his mother, my great-grandmother Mariah, stopped eating, refused to see doctors, and she too died. There's something awful now in thinking about my mother telling me this story when I was just a little kid. But the truth is, I loved my mother's stories, some of them even more gruesome than that one, even when they involved starving Irish grannies and impecunious youth. Maybe in part, I don't know, but maybe in part because I didn't quite believe them. Now I can see all the key narrative elements. It's Horatio Algiers meets Newsies. Does Newsies mean anything to anyone over 25? Okay. But anyway, to those of you who are Christian Bale fans, you'll know what I mean. Meets a certain much beloved, to Irish Americans at least, strand of High Gothic. So I loved the story, or at least it fascinated me, and later could analyze its religious, political, ethnic, and gender implications, the play of power, oppression, desire, and anxiety that ran through each episode, and perhaps even more of the conditions of its telling. On some fundamental level, though, the older I got, and I'm only into my early 20s at this point when I'm thinking about this, the older I got, the less I believed it. The thing is, though, it turned out to be true. After my father died, when I was 23, I opened the gray lockbox that I'd seen on his desk for years, and oddly, given that I'd rifled through every other available object in the house, had never opened. I can only remember 2 of the things that were in the box. My father's flight record from World War II. It was the original flight record, now lost. And a copy, now also lost, of my great-grandmother's death certificate. Mariah, in parentheses, Smith, and there's a whole other story there about ethnicity, poverty, and servitude that I will leave you to think about. Mariah Smith Hollywood died at the age of 55. The cause of death, acute melancholia. I tell this story about the power of loss, literally to kill, because it serves as a cautionary backdrop for my current research. From the 14th century German Dominican nun Margaret Ebner to Freud to the contemporary philosopher Judith Butler and Ada Ray, I grant, all of them resonating with my own experience. I've learned that one way we deal with loss is through an internalization of the lost other, who then becomes an ineradicable part of who we are. I'm interested in the bodily, psychic, spiritual, and mental practices by which we are formed and reformed, in the role of loss and incorporation in those practices, and in the ways in which they give rise to forms of subjectivity that are always intersubjective, and are also always necessarily, although in complex ways, sexed, gendered, sexualized, raced, and marked by the other salient differences that constitute the social worlds of which we are a part. I'm interested in trying to embrace that melancholic aspect of subjectivity, in attempting to depathologize melancholia. And yet at the same time, in the back of my mind, is always the story of my paternal great-grandmother, whose melancholia, whose losses were so overwhelming that they led to her death. What I want to do today is almost the outline for a very large project, and so I'm going to go be a little looser here in some of my presentations. What I want to do today is tell you a little bit about how I came to be interested in this topic, what led me to think about melancholia as both an important category for thinking about subjectivity and an important category for thinking about subjectivity in both political and religious ways. I first came to these questions through the study, my own study, as Stephanie has just spoken about, of medieval mysticism. It's probably no accident that I was working on Margaret Ebner and came to these insights the year that one of my brothers and one of my sisters were both very ill. So the fact that I was thinking about mourning and saw this in this text, there's a relationship between these two things. But I think that it is in the text. I don't think it's just me reading melancholically. What we see in the later Middle Ages is the intensity of desire to enact and reenact the Passion of Christ, Christ's suffering and death on the cross, which was the central religiously salient loss for medieval Christians. It's in the later later Middle Ages that we begin to get the proliferation of passion narratives, of handbooks telling us how to think about, how to try to imagine visually, to smell, to taste, to hear the Passion of Christ before one's mind's eye or ear and sensorium. These texts begin to be produced in Latin. They then are translated into the vernaculars. They're incredibly important for the religious life and devotional practice of late medieval men and women. And I want to give two examples, one for Beatrice of Nazareth from the 13th century and the other, Margaret Ebner, who I already mentioned, from the 14th century. Two examples to give you some sense of the role of mourning and melancholia in the Passion as it's in meditation upon the Passion of Christ as it's enacted in their text. And what we have with both Beatrice and Ebner is their own accounts of how they enacted this devotional practice, not simply a guidebook for how one should enact the Passion, which is what a lot of the Passion narratives themselves are. Beatrice of Nazareth, she was a Cistercian nun in the 13th century. Her hagiographer, who based many of his writings on her own text, writes of her devotion, particularly to the cross of Christ. And I want to read this rather long passage because it gives you some sense of the intensity of this desire to think about the cross. Day and night she wore on her breast a wooden cross, about a palm in length, tightly tied with a knotted string. On it was written the Lord's Passion, the horror of the Last Judgment, the severity of the judge, and other things she wanted always to keep in mind. Besides this, she also carried tied to her arm another image of the Lord's cross painted on a piece of parchment. It's like a little phylactery. I don't know what kind of interreligious thing was going on at this period that gave rise to that practice. She had a third cross painted on a piece of wood that she set before her whenever she was writing, so that wherever she went or whatever exterior work she did, all forgetfulness would be banished. And by means of the image of the cross, she would keep firmly impressed on her mind and heart whatever she feared to lose. What she feared to lose was memory of Christ's Passion. Not only did Beatrice's hagiographer describe her as making use of devotional objects to aid in her meditative practice, but there is a proliferation of these objects. They're everywhere, and we see this throughout the hagiographies and many of the female author texts of this period, crosses upon crosses upon crosses with which they surround themselves, and not just crosses but crucifixes. What this proliferation suggests is both the desire that the cross be ever present to the believer and its tendency to slip from memory in the absence of external reminders. Yet the wooden cross and the paper images of the cross, or images of the cross painted on parchment, ultimately, however, become unnecessary. The goal of Beatrice's meditation on Christ's cross seems to be met when she has so fully internalized the image of Christ's Passion as to be unable not to see it before her mind's eye. This, again, is her hagiographer. He says that, therefore, for about 5 unbroken years, she had the mental image of the Lord's Passion so firmly impressed in her memory that she scarcely ever quit this sweet meditation, but clung from the bottom of her heart with wonderful devotion to everything he deigned to suffer for the salvation of the human race." End quote. The hagiographer thus depicts Beatrice as having so successfully internalized that which is represented on the cross as no longer to require external aid for her meditative practice. Wherever she went, she saw before her mind's eye Christ's suffering and death on the cross. In the case of Margaret Ebner, about a full century later, we can see the same practices being enacted. The proliferation of crosses, the desire to hear the Passion of Christ spoken of, and then, miraculously, the Passion of Christ being so visibly present to her mind's eye that she can't not see it even if she chooses not to see it. She can't not hear the wrenching of his limbs. She can't not hear his outcries on the cross. And eventually, in fact, for Margaret, eventually her identification with the Passion of Christ goes so far that she's no longer identifying simply with the onlookers. She's no longer Mary standing at the foot of the cross, which is what much of the Passion narratives tell you to do. Be like Mary at the foot of the cross, weeping over the loss of her son. No, Margaret goes further, and she becomes Christ on the cross itself. Her body becomes racked with the pain that Christ himself experienced. She never makes that claim in that bald form. She doesn't have the hubris to make such a claim in its bald form, but it's clear in her representation of herself as a stigmatic, as one who experiences the pain of the Passion on her body, that that's the claim being made. One of the ways she puts it, I'll read one passage just to give you some sense of this. She writes fairly late in the cycle of her meditative practice about one Passion Week in which she felt an inner pain in my hands as if they were stretched out, torn, and broken through. And I suppose that they would always be useless to me thereafter. In my head, I felt a wondrous pain as if I were pierced and broken through. That seemed so excruciating to me that I began to tremble and shook so violently that the sisters had to hold me fast, the sisters, her fellow nuns. I trembled while in their grasp, and I felt this trembling for a long time after Easter, whenever I prayed earnestly or read or talked. And I perceived the same painful brokenness in all my members, especially on both sides and on my back, arms, and legs, so that it seemed to me I was in the last throes, and that all this suffering would continue until death, if it were the will of God." End quote. One of the things that becomes visible in Ebner's text that isn't visible in the writings surrounding and by Beatrice of Nazareth is that Margaret makes it relatively clear that her intense focus on the suffering and death of Christ is in some ways at least a displacement of mourning over lost beloved persons around her. So her book opens with the account of how after a lifetime of illness she had lost the nurse, the fellow nun who had taken care of her. And she talks about her enormous grief in the face of that loss. And what you recognize, she never quite explicitly says this, but what you recognize is that over the course of a year, 2 years after this woman's death, she comes to displace her suffering over that woman's death with her suffering over Christ's death, and with her intent upon internalizing Christ's passion onto her own body. Now, one of the theological problems raised by both Beatrice of Nazareth and Ebner is that both of them actively desire not only to suffer. Beatrice is the suffering of the will that's desired. Ebner is much more suffering of the body. That's the century that comes between them marks that difference. But they also both desire death. They say quite explicitly in their own writings, they quote Paul, two important Pauline passages, "I desire to be dissolved with Christ." Right? I desire to die with Christ. And they actively are seeking that death through the extremes of their meditative practice, although without harming themselves deliberately in any way. The other that they incorporate, Christ, is the suffering and dying Christ on the cross. And it's only through death that they can be fully one with him. What we get here is an account of a melancholic who, in some sense, incorporates another melancholic, and therefore that death that is desired by Christ on the cross, because he wants to suffer for humanity, out of his love for humanity, becomes intrinsic to the identity of both Ebner and Beatrice. The other thing I should say here, just as an aside, is that there is a medieval discourse about melancholia. It's a physiological ailment, and it's understood as an ailment that gives rise to a lassitude and lack of desire to live. It is condemned to a certain extent, or seen as the work of demons, when that melancholia is the result of one's suffering over the loss of a loved human being. What's fascinating about these mystical texts and some of the writings about Christ in the Passion narratives is that Christ and these mystics all are represented as having all of the physical characteristics of the melancholic. But what they're melancholic for, what they're suffering for, is the loss of sinful humanity in Christ's case, or the loss of Christ in the case of the mystic. Melancholia, when embraced as part of the salvific project of Christ, is not a source of pathologization or sinfulness, but as rather a source of saintliness and valorization. And so that you can see a split in the way in which melancholia is understood, even though it's not explicitly named as melancholia in the religious text that I'm aware of. You can see that doubleness operative in these texts. And it becomes clear when you turn to Teresa of Avila in the 16th century, who says, look, melancholia is not what my nuns are doing. My nuns are doing something else. So she recognizes that there could be the conflation of the two and says, oh, no, we're going to separate them out. Earlier, it was much more difficult to do that. All right, so my reading of Ebner in particular led me to try to think about the nature of melancholy as incorporation, a notion of melancholia that has its origins in the work of Karl Abraham, but most importantly in the work of Sigmund Freud. Freud theorizes mourning and melancholia first as antithetical experiences of responses to loss. And mourning is the healthy response, melancholia is the pathological response. This is in his paper from 1914, Mourning and Melancholia. In mourning, Freud writes, we replace the lost object with another to whom we become attached. So we decathect, as he would put it, we unattach ourselves from the loved object, a libidinal object to whom we are libidinally attached, and love and libidinal attachment aren't the same for Freud, but we'll leave that for the moment. And we just kind of let go of that attachment, and then we move on to another one. And one of the this great line in Freud where he says, I just don't understand why this is so painful for people. It's an economic problem for him in terms of the psyche. Why this should be so painful? Why we shouldn't be able just to decathect and then recathect onto somebody else and make our way merrily along. He's aware of the fact, acutely aware of the fact, however, that is not the case. And by the end of the essay, he actually has ended up dissolving the category of normal mourning and making every mourning person look like a melancholic. Because what melancholics do, according to Freud, is they refuse to acknowledge the loss of the object. The loss of the loved other. And that loss can come about in melancholia not only through death, but through de-idealization, through absence, through disappointment, through lots of different kinds of more complex phenomena. What Freud argues, and it's a complex argument that I don't want to get into the details of, but I do want to point to this. What he argues is that you decathect from that object, and you turn your object cathexis onto yourself. And you say, well, I can't have that object, so I'll love myself. But at the same time, you idealize that lost object, and you then incorporate that idealized lost object into yourself. And so in loving yourself, what you're loving is that lost object, who in fact is now not lost because it's internal to you. Okay? Now, the vagaries of why he makes this complex argument, I won't get into, and it is complex, and it has a lot to do with his eschewing of anything that might look like homoeroticism. But regardless, the point is that we take in. We refuse to accept the loss of the other because we take that other into ourselves in some fundamental way. That lost other lives on in us in some fundamental way. And that living on is an ambivalent one for Freud always, because we both love the lost object, but we also have a certain amount of aggressivity and hatred towards the lost object because of its abandonment of us. And so that internally incorporated object is one who both shores up the subject, but also one who is that critical function that becomes for Freud the superego. In his later essay, The Ego and the Id of 1923. It's in that later essay, The Ego and the Id, that Freud argues that the mechanism of melancholic incorporation, which he's tried to put aside as something pathological in the earlier piece, is now understood as being constitutive of the ego and of the superego. The very way we are constituted as subjects for Freud by 1923 is through the processes of melancholic incorporation. It's our negotiation of absence or loss that gives rise to the incorporations that actually serve as the core of our, what he calls at some points, character, at other points, ego, sometimes subjectivity. He uses a lot of different language that, again, requires a certain amount of unpacking to get to the details of Freud's argument, but the push of the argument is clear. That for Freud, our subjectivities, our psyches are always intersubjectively constituted. They're always constituted through the incorporation of these others to whom we stand in often ambivalent relationships. One of the questions to ask here is what Freud's theory, whether, I should say, not what, but whether Freud's theory helps us think about somebody like Ebner. On the one hand, I think that there's clearly something like this form of identification and incorporation, identification, idealization, and incorporation. I should add third term, operative in the works of Beatrice of Nazareth and of Margaret Ebner, so that there's some kind of parallelism. I don't know quite what kind of causal connection to make, but there's some kind of parallelism, at the very least, going on in the practices of Beatrice of Nazareth and in what what Freud is describing in terms of melancholic incorporation as constitutive of subjectivity. One of the crucial differences, of course, is that Ebner and Beatrice are both describing adult experience that comes about both through the operations of grace and through directed practices. And that the notion is in place, and I'll pick this up a little more in a minute, the notion is in place in both Beatrice and in Ebner that however we are constituted as subjects in our first formation as a human being socially operative in the world, however we are formed in that first moment, is subject to revision, is subject to change through actively embraced practices and through the operations of grace for both of them. The other thing I would ask is, and this is a question that I asked to both Freud and Ebner, is how it is that it's only the father, in Freud's case, and I didn't tell that whole story, but for Freud, really the central object who's incorporated is the father, who is the incorporated object who becomes the superego, who sort of bosses us for the rest of our life. Or not, depending on your dad. But anyway, in Freud's scenario, he's the one who bosses you for the rest of your life. So why is it this single figure that gets focused on? You know, Freud starts out with us melancholically incorporating all sorts of people, and then by the time he gets to the ego and the id, and to later writings on the superego, it's all about the father. It's all about the internalization, idealization, and incorporation of the father, who becomes constitutive of the superego and the ego. So why that narrowing down to this one figure? And in the case of Ebner, a narrowing down to the single figure of Christ. What about our other losses? In Ebner, we can see her displacing other losses onto the loss of Christ, that socially, religiously valorized site of loss within medieval Christianity. Is Freud doing the same thing? Is his valorization of the father, again, a displacing of other losses, encapsulating of other losses within this one culturally valorized site of loss, that of the father? I think something like that is going on. So that's one of the ways that Ebner helps us to read Freud against himself. The last theorist I want to talk about is Melanie Klein, who she wasn't directly a student or an alison of Freud's, but of students of Freud's, of Sandro Ferenczi and of Carl Abraham, and she works within a Freudian context, but often at odds with that Freudian context in ways that she kept saying, no, I'm not at odds with it. Anyway, she suggests a way to broach some of these issues. In an essay from 1940 entitled Mourning and Its Relation to Manic Depressive States, she argues that all mourning is melancholic. She makes explicit what is implicit already in Freud, and that incorporation is essential to normal mourning. For Klein, the internalization of living others around us, as well as of the dead, is multiple and ongoing. These others constitute subjectivity in childhood, but they continue to constitute us and reshape us throughout our life. As she writes in this essay, quote, in normal mourning, the individual reinterjects and reinstates, as well as the actual lost person, his loved parents who are felt to be good inner objects. His inner world, the one which he has built up from his earliest days onwards, in his fantasy was destroyed when the actual loss occurred. So your parents die again. With that, your parents and the other good beings who you internalized as a child who supported your subjectivities, your big brothers and sisters, whoever it was who was around you caring for you. Though that internally generated world of good objects is damaged, is lost every time we experience another loss. And what we need to do is rebuild that world. And part of the rebuilding of that world is the reincorporation of those initially lost others and the incorporation of the lost loved one in the present. The rebuilding of this inner world, she writes, characterizes the successful work of mourning, end quote. Melancholy for Klein, who am I talking about, is ineradicable, disabling depression, And it is experienced when the subject has been unable as a child to establish a good inner world that will then sustain her through her losses. And this both has to do with the interiority of the subject and the subject's capacity to fantasize and to build a good inner world. And it also has to do with the way that the outer world treats her, the way she experiences the external world. What I would suggest in a sort of addition to this kind of theoretical claim made by Klein is that it may be that one finds oneself unable to mourn, to complete mourning, if you ever complete mourning. In some sense, if melancholia is mourning, then you never complete mourning. But at least not to fall into this disabling, depressive, suicidal kind of melancholic mourning. One is unable to resist that when the losses are too many, when they are too overwhelming for the good parents, the good inner objects of the inner world to combat. That's what I think about when I think about my great-grandmother, Hollywood. I'd also suggest, on the basis of my work on Beatrice, Ebner, and others from the Middle Ages, that inner worlds are not only created in childhood, but that through bodily, psychic, spiritual, and mental practices, we can, at least to some degree, recreate or reshape aspects of ourselves in the image of newly idealized objects. The problem, again, with Beatrice and Ebner is that the idealized other they incorporate is idealized precisely in his suffering and death, so that melancholia here feeds melancholia rather than allaying it. In a talk that I gave last term called Feminist Melancholia, I'm sort of running a gambit through the adjectives here, I spoke about the political necessity of recognizing the relational constitution of the subject. What I said then was this. To disavow the melancholic constitution of the subject is to disavow the complex constellation of others who make us who and what we are. It is to disavow our losses and our grief, as well as that which supports and enables our subjectivity, our agency, and, paradoxically, our responsibility. It is to deny our responsibility to the others within, and thereby to disavow that which makes possible our relations with others outside of ourselves, the very grounds of sociality from which our political, ethical, and religious projects emerge. End quote. I also spoke that night about the ways in which my now lost others both haunt and sustain me. What I'd like to close with today is some brief reflections on the theological implications of these claims, and then with a story, the only way I found, so far, to gesture toward the intersubjectively articulated, immanent transcendence that is as close as I can come to an avowal of belief. Freud is generally taken as being stupidly reductionistic with regard to religion, and wildly unoriginal to boot. To Ludwig Feuerbach's Man, oh man, God is man, which is how we always talked about it when I was in college, he adds only, and he's your father. Okay, what do I mean there? If Feuerbach talks about the projection, right, of human capacities, human values, human possibilities onto a divine other, those things which we as individual limited beings are unable to perform, to do, to possess, but that are part of our existence as a human species for Feuerbach, we project outside of ourselves to a divine other who we see as being radically different from the human species itself. And the Feuerbachian project, and this is fast and loose and crude, but the Feuerbachian project is in part to reincorporate into ourselves as human species those values, those goals, those aspirations, those capacities that we have projected onto and alienated from ourselves through that projection onto God. Freud, in Future of the Illusion in particular, but also in other texts, is baldly Feuerbachian in his account of the mechanisms of religious projection. He wants to add a psychical dimension to that. And in adding a psychical dimension to that, he focuses again upon the role of the Father as that being in whom we are most invested, both in our projections and in our incorporations. And so that, again, it's the figure of the Father who becomes the central divine figure in Freud's reading of religion, particularly of Christianity, but not only of Christianity, and then becomes that object once again who ideally we will incorporate within ourselves rather than project outside ourselves. And we will incorporate within ourselves as that superego who will lead us to great heights of civilized behavior and artistic creativity and scientific productivity. I mean, this is the Freud when he's having a vision of some possible future. Okay, so there is this account of projection and incorporation that is operating in both Feuerbach and in Freud that is routinely referred to as reductionistic in a bad way. Yet I keep wondering, I've been wondering for a long time, if Feuerbach wasn't right, and if, in a way, Freud isn't then too. And I want to say in what way. The problematic bit is that Freud's reductionist with regard to religion in the same way he's reductionist about melancholy. He seems to think the only loss we mourn is that of our Father. But there's something right, I want to suggest, in his positing that what we know of the divine, we know from others around and within ourselves. And it's the relationship between those two propositions, around and within, that I don't yet know how to articulate, except by telling you yet another story. One of the suggestions I want to make is that the multiplicity necessary to rendering melancholy and its incorporations livable, the sight of the desire for life, for creativity, for love, depends upon our recognition that it is within and between and in those intersubjective relationships with others that the divine is made manifest. The fact that I choose to tell a story raises a host of questions about the relationship between narrative and theory, about storytelling as a mode of incorporation and the incorporation constitutive of subjectivity, about storytelling and theorizing as practices through which others are incorporated even as they are maintained in their exteriority to the subject. I point to these theoretical issues as the background against which I read my story. This one required, for reasons, again, I need to figure out, fictionalization. Yet it is as true as anything I know. The story is called The Goodness of Our Brother's Heart. They didn't do eulogies. The father liked often to announce that if any of his children attempted to eulogize him, he would haunt them remorselessly for the rest of their lives. The prospect was less frightening than intended. In the many years they survived him, all of his children longed for the presence of their father, however ghostly. But still, when he died, they'd honored his wishes, and they kept their love to themselves. Other losses followed, and what sometimes felt to the survivors like one long, endless funeral reception. Grandmothers, aunts, uncles, their mother, all rigorously uneulogized. A brother who died so shortly before his mother that there was no time even to mourn. 2 sisters and a brother remained. Not Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Nobody names their kids Lazarus anymore. But those names will do as well as any others. To Mary and Martha, although they never admitted it out loud, and certainly not to each other, and certainly not to Lazarus, Lazarus was an extraordinary human being. It was less his beauty they loved, although they loved his beauty, even as it faded, than his goodness. Lazarus, however, wasn't only handsome and good, he was also troubled and unlucky. And it was difficult for Mary and Martha to know whether his goodness led to trouble or if the one, like the other, was a sheer, astonishing accident. For Lazarus' goodness had no cause and no traceable source. It had nothing to do with the categorical imperative or the cultivation of virtue or utilitarian determination of the greatest good for the greatest number. It couldn't be taught, and it certainly wasn't hereditary. But maybe Mary and Martha thought, it's just that he's our brother and we love him. Maybe he isn't any different than anyone else. Despite such humbling thoughts, Mary and Martha worried about Lazarus. As they lost father, mother, and brother, they each thought quietly to themselves, anything, please, but Lazarus. They had partners, children, lives in which Lazarus was often for months at a time peripheral. And yet, both Mary and Martha knew that he was the moral center, the moral compass of their lives. With an inevitability that still managed to take both sisters by surprise, Lazarus got sick. All 3 denied it for as long as they could. Not that he was sick, but that the sickness would kill him. I'm not ready to die yet, he said to Martha. Mary and Martha would have given up the no eulogies rule for Lazarus, but after his death, neither of them could speak. Not coherently, at least, and not about Lazarus. Instead, they spoke through the songs and the readings of the Roman Catholic funeral mass his faith required. They chose passages about building an edifice for the Lord, about God as a mighty fortress, and the Father's house having many rooms. Lazarus was a carpenter and a builder, and he had the greatest capacity for friendship and for love that either sister had ever seen. No matter how you feel about the Bible, Mary said, and somewhere in there it says just about everything. They thought about using the story from the Gospel of John about Jesus' friends Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. But under the circumstances, it seemed self-serving, a public claim to the superiority of their love for their brother over all other claimants, his daughters and his wife, his extended family of cousins, in-laws, and friends. More to the point, Mary announced, in the kind of wonderful feat of projection at which she excelled, we don't want to upset anyone. They'll hear that, expect Jesus to come raise Lazarus up from the dead, and get pissed off when it doesn't happen. So Mary and Martha stuck with the father's many-roomed mansion. They called in their selection to the priest, an old family friend who had known their parents and who had known Mary and Martha and Lazarus since they were children. The priest honored the no eulogy rule, and he didn't speak personally about Lazarus. But, whether through chance or design, the sisters never knew, he read from the Gospel of John. He read the story of Jesus' friends, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, and of Mary and Martha's great grief and of their great faith, and of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. And in his sermon, he spoke directly to the hearts of our Mary and our Martha, and he told them that their brother was not dead and that he would live forever. But as Mary predicted, Jesus didn't come, and he didn't raise Lazarus from the dead on that day or on any other that the sisters lived to see. The priest saw their lack of faith, and he spoke to it, but he couldn't heal it, because he couldn't bring their brother back to them. They were heartbroken and desolate and no longer sure even of Lazarus' goodness, now that they could no longer see it before them, sense it in the world around them, know that it lay readily available on the edges of their worlds. The old worry that his goodness had been a mirage created by their love returned. And with that doubt, any possibility of a reality transcendent to the anguish in which he had died was forever, irrevocably destroyed. To hear your brother cry, help, help, and to have nothing to offer but the morphine that will kill him. Mary held him down, sitting at the feet of the Lord, while Martha got the nurse with the syringe. And Martha was busy with many things. But as long as someone survives, there is always more to tell. No one ever raised Lazarus from the dead. No one ever will. But on the day Lazarus was buried, an old woman and her husband told Mary and Martha a story. It was a story about their brother's goodness, a story that showed them that Lazarus wasn't only good in their eyes and in the reflection of their love, which in itself maybe should have been enough. But Mary and Martha were obsessed with objectivity and truth, a result, no doubt, of their overly abundant philosophical educations. But he was good also in the eyes of at least one old couple. It was, Mary and Martha often said to each other in the long years they lived without their brother, a story about the goodness that the man Jesus must have had, the kind of goodness that would make people tell stories about a man so good that he raised a beloved brother from the dead simply to staunch two sisters' grief. The kind of goodness that has no discernible source and so renders belief in transcendence not only possible, but perhaps inevitable, even if it can't bring the dead back to life in the beauty and goodness of the flesh. Perhaps no story can bear that weight outside of the eyes of love. The old woman told Mary and Martha that she too had loved their brother. He had built a house for her, the house in which she and her husband planned to live out their old age. She dreamed of the house for years, its spaces and lights and shadows. She found the land for the house, and Lazarus took her dream, and he drew plans. He came every week to talk over the work's progress, to ensure that her desires were met in each detail of its rendering. He gave her the house of her imagination. And as they planned and talked and gossiped, she told him about a drawer she had been lugging from house to house throughout her adult life. She didn't inherit it from her mother, who had inherited it from her mother. It was full of broken and discarded religious objects, Catholic kitsch, Mary as Queen of Heaven with her crown of stars chipped, scapulars that wouldn't stick together anymore, a baby Jesus whose upraised arm had broken off. Trash, but to this very pious family, grandmother, mother, aunts, even a few uncles, holy and blessed objects that you didn't simply throw away. Yet how long, the old woman wondered aloud to Lazarus, do you lug a drawer full of broken Marys and Josephs and Jesuses around? The truth is, the old woman's husband told the rest of the story, because she, like Mary and Martha, could no longer speak. On the day the concrete was to go into the foundation of the new house, Lazarus came and picked up the old woman, and he carried the drawer full of holy junk out of her apartment and put it in the flatbed of his truck. This is the way the husband told the story. Together, Lazarus and the old woman, it's only one of them, went to the building site, and Lazarus helped her climb down into the rectangular pit he and his workmen had dug for the foundation. He followed her down, carrying the drawer. Together, Lazarus and the old woman lay Mary and Joseph and Jesus and whoever or whatever else was in the drawer on the freshly turned dirt. He thought of that, the old woman said. He didn't. Mary and Martha both thought simultaneously to themselves. The man and the woman lived out the rest of their lives in the house of their dreams, a house embedded with her family's faith, a house, in the words Mary told Martha, or Martha told Mary, or they told themselves, night after night for the rest of their lives, a house built with the labor of our brother's hands, with the goodness of our brother's heart, of my brother's heart, my brother Daniel. Thank you.
To say anything after a lecture like that, but I would like to offer everyone the opportunity for about 10 minutes before we move to a reception to ask questions if you have some, since our gracious lecturer has indicated her willingness to take some questions. And I'll just let you take the questions.
Sure, that's fine. Oh, David, I'm sorry. Thank you. Thanks, Layla.
It's more of a meditation, which is probably more in keeping with your Seder this afternoon. And I would just, the terms I would use are when loss becomes gain, and how loss can transmute into gain. And in a sense, that's one of the implicit motifs of some of the things that you've been saying here. But to go back to the two medieval women and their own embodying or taking on Christ or dissolving into Christ, one might just offer this reflection, which is not based on the text, which I don't know, but just on a more theological perspective, that the Jesus who dies on the cross is also the Christ who rises, so that, and they know that because they're not living in 80s, they're,
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So their melancholia, or the Christ who might seem melancholic, is also the Christ of joy, prophecy fulfilled, the gift here, the Christ who brings us gifts. So dissolving into Christ is to accept and receive that gift, which is gain. So it's this dialectic that seems a bit truncated in your...
Yeah, in the rendition of I gave. Yeah. I mean, in some sense, that's right, David. And in some sense, one of my worries about them, and this is something I didn't have time fully to extend, is that it gets truncated in their text. They become so immersed in that identification with the suffering Christ that, I mean, one of the things that happens with Ebner, for example, is initially she goes through a liturgical cycle each year where she suffers with Christ during the Passion Week, and then in the Resurrection Day she is well and can get up and can engage in the life of the community. The description, that the piece that I gave, read from, you may note, they said even after Easter she still couldn't get up. So that there's a tendency for the sight of painful suffering, redemption, painful suffering, well, it is redemption, but it's a redemption of what? It becomes unclear to some extent in reading them what it's a redemption of, or if the suffering itself hasn't become the sole thing of value within their account of the theological world. And that, I think, is the danger that others saw in their text. I mean, when Teresa of Avila wants to separate out the melancholic sisters from those sisters who are living the proper religious life, it's precisely because she's worried about certain nuns who she sees as so fully immersed in this passion-centered kind of devotional life as to be feeding what she sees as a pathological melancholy rather than doing the proper theological work that they should be, in which they should be engaged. But you're right. It's always against, at least implicitly, against the theological background of not only redemption for oneself but also of others, and by becoming Christ-like and by suffering with Christ, having the ability to bring about the redemption of others with Christ. And so you become a co-redeemer with Christ, which is the ultimate goal.
Great American text is Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Yeah. Yeah.
Precisely that.
Right, exactly. But it's interesting in Uncle Tom's Cabin, too, I mean, to think about that example, that little Ava and Tom both have to die repeatedly, right? You know, how many deathbed sequences are there? That there's this kind of sense in which the death is so focused on as the moment of redemption that there's this reiteration of that deathbed sequence with Ava and the extreme brutality with Tom. So that I think that there's that I have a worry, even while I'm attracted to certain aspects of the confrontation with death that occurs in these texts, about the extent to which the ways of thinking about incorporation as a mode of living is potentially lost. You're still thinking something, Ed?
Well, it's not appropriate to carry on.
Okay. Yeah, Janet.
Well, I'm just wondering about, in all of this, how integral is the relationship between the incorporation and the identification and the loss and the death?
Yeah.
When I started listening to you, and I think it was Beatrice that you were talking about, who incorporated so well that she's literally shaking and completely sort of taking on the same suffering. And I started thinking about the people that I study in Tibet, which I'm just sort of wondering how the comparison might help or shed light somewhat on the project, where there is one example of a case where techniques of identification and incorporation are extremely highly developed. There's a great deal of technical, theoretical literature on how you do it, what the steps are, what the visualizations are. And yet, the part of the puzzle about the loss is what I'm just wondering.
It's not there.
Well, I'm not saying it's not entirely there, and some people have tried to, it's not entirely not there, because some people try to say, well, this is about, the Buddha has died, and this is the way to bring the Buddha into our, and they kind of go that route. But the fact of the matter is that these guys are not only identifying with the Buddha or any other historical figure who has died, or said to have died, but these ideal figures who, and there it's like a very conscious and very deliberate, aesthetic life in which you have this sort of ideal model in which you're just learning how to make that, as you say, shore up your ego, and all the kind of stuff that happens in this intensity and the passion and all of it. But the lost part, and then I don't know how continuous this is then with the other elements of, like the kind of identifications that we do all the time. So using the psychoanalytic theory that you were drawing on, kind of identifications that we do all the time amongst our friends.
Right,
and
absolutely.
So how does one sort of triangulate the element of the loss and the suffering with the rest of and how important is that? Yeah, and I think that I was thinking about this as I was going through this again today and thinking that this is a big question mark, because one of the things is that and Klein is useful in terms of thinking about this psychoanalytically, where it doesn't have to be about loss per se, but that in every relationship with another, and in some sense the more idealized the other, the more this is the case, there is some absence or some gap between ourselves and that idealized other. And so that what one might argue in that case is that the experience of the actual death of another is just an intensification of that logic that is internal to our relations with other, even as we all live and work and together, so that it becomes more of a continuum where loss is the extremity of a certain kind of experience that in fact we're enacting all the time. And that's one of the things that Klein says. I mean, when the small child is engaged in this acts of incorporation, it doesn't depend upon a disavowal of our desire for them in the Freudian sense, nor does it depend upon their actual loss or their actual absence. It depends on that gap that as we come to recognize ourselves as subjects in the world, there is always a split between ourselves and others. And so it's that split and the desire to overcome that split that leads to an internalization of the other as always readily available, and then a constant negotiation between our felt experience of the other and the external world. And so there's a lot of reality testing going on where we're trying to figure out how, what we're experiencing in the world matches up with our inner fantasies of what's going on. And then when another dies and is radically unavailable to us, that is a kind of crisis in the inner world, because we no longer have the outer world to test against. And we fall back on the resources solely of our internal world.
That all of that that's a lot of very rich and important stuff in that. I guess what I'm asking then is why the production in certain other religious cultures of a technology of many of these phenomena, which are also extremely intense.
Yeah.
So these are ascetics living in caves, stigmata-like things happening where, on their actual body stuff,
sure,
all that kind of stuff. That it doesn't seem to be. I mean, I have to really push it to say this is that the dynamics of loss is sort of essential to what
right.
we're doing, given that in many cases these are these idolized, sort of forms of the Buddha who never have lived. There's nothing about them dying.
Yeah. And what that suggests, and I think what that suggests that's useful, and I mean, it's not directly speaking to what David was asked, but it's part of the same nexus of questions. Maybe the way I phrased it here was sounded overly like I was reading a certain kind of asceticism and a certain kind of practice as tied to the specificity of Christ's suffering body, when in fact it may be part of the logic of a certain kind of asceticism, whether it happens in relationship to an idealized suffering body or not.
Right, because in this case that I'm looking at, it's an idealized happy body.
Yeah, exactly. So that suggests that you can engage in the same kinds of ascetic practice. Right. And that's actually really useful, because one of the things that gets said if you present the work about Ebner to certain audiences, there is certain audiences, by which I mean, audiences that can be Christian, but of a certain sort, of a certain modernist, get no pain, we don't like pain sort, or non-Christian audiences is like, oh, that's just that weird medieval suffering Jesus thing. Do you know what I mean? And what you're suggesting is no, it's not just about that weird medieval suffering Jesus thing. That there's something about the logic of asceticism that brings about these intensities of these forms of bodily practices. And it doesn't depend upon the nature of the figure idealized in the way that I suggested. No, that's actually really helpful for me. Yeah, Sarah.
Thank you for a very rich and fascinating lecture. I wonder whether you think that the descriptions say that Teresa Maria gives or moving,
Yeah.
in which we are moving really beyond states which one might be tempted to pathology.
Yeah.
In the life and in actions.
Sure.
Could really be satisfactorily accounted for in Freudian terms.
Yeah.
Because I think the whole of your lecture tends to assume that we can utilize Freudian categories to apply them to Christian texts in which the death of Christ is equivalent to, say, the death of a
Sure. Yeah.
And it seems to me that theologically speaking, the death of Christ is not in the same category as the death of my father.
Well, yeah, I mean,
Because the death of Christ, when seen through the lens of Paul and the tradition that comes after, has an archetypal and inclusive categorization, which moves beyond grief.
well, it moves beyond grief if you believe in the resurrection, and Teresa certainly did. And I guess the reality of what I'm putting forward here is that I don't, and that I see within the Christian traditions the traces of that doubt expressed in some of the same in the mystical tradition itself. Now, not in Teresa. Well, I mean, traces of the doubt are in Teresa, but it's a doubt that she wants constantly to disavow, and she disavows precisely by making these kinds of, moves to say, these are the sisters in my convent who aren't doing so well and need to go see a doctor, and these are the sisters in my convent, or who are on the right path. I don't know quite what to do with that beyond make that assertion. I don't. The second question would be, is there something in Teresa that I think can be explained, or in other figures that I have worked on, that can be read in Freudian terms. Well, I'm not really, it may sound like it, but I'm less interested in reading things in Freudian terms than I'm interested in finding certain contemporary vocabularies that have resonated for me and resonate in ways that are helpful in understanding what's going on in texts that to many people are very alien and very foreign and very hard to get a handle on. And also in having those texts speak back to Freud in certain crucial and important ways. But it is the case that you're going to have a very immanental theology coming out of this notion, if any, coming out of this notion of intersubjective melancholic subjectivity that I'm putting forward. And it's one that, any notion of the resurrection is going to be a very, I don't want to say attenuated because that sounds so unpleasant, but it's not going to be a notion of the resurrection like Teresa had. Let's put it that way. I don't know how better to say that at the moment. Yeah, Connie?
Well, one of the things that strikes me about all three of the questions so far is that maybe the sense that what's going on is that you seem to be prioritizing, centralizing loss in a way that in various ways people are questioning. And I wonder in some ways, in thinking about the story, that what you think about the idea that to end with this idea that other couple, that in other words, that people outside the dynamic of those who felt the loss themselves, I mean, the couple felt the loss, but the sisters who lost their brother, that they are kind of, they are bringing a kind of resurrection, right? A kind of,
absolutely,
to go back
absolutely,
to the transcendence thing,
right.
And I'm sort of thinking in Janet's terms of sort of, you're saying the happy body, I guess, and Sarah was saying the resurrection, and I guess in many ways I thought that was what David was picking up on too, is where's the resurrection in all this? And you're saying, I really don't believe in the resurrection, but you do want this imminent transcendence thing. But I wonder if that's where the transcendence, is that how you read that story?
I don't know. I mean, certainly. I mean, and that's why I said I don't want to say, resurrection redemption in an attenuated sense because it sounds, thin and unpleasant, and yet at the same time, I do think it's what there is of resurrection that we have, right? Is the stories that we tell and the way that people are incorporated within our own subjectivities.
Are by definition not just the stories we tell to ourselves.
Right, absolutely, absolutely.
The act of storytelling is relational and social,
right?
And that's what you're foregrounding with exactly. Other people. You needed the other people to come and tell that story too.
Right, absolutely. And that it's that and that's part of the nature of the relationality of the intersubjectivity that isn't just about the incorporation into my psyche, but is also about the incorporation into the communities made up of individuals who create social bonds between them through others who are incorporated in those narratives. So that's that sort of doubleness of incorporation that I was thinking about. That it's not just a story about the psyche, but it's also about incorporation within social networks from which they do not die with their death, at least not in an immediate sense.
Amy, maybe one more.
Okay, one more. Yeah, Vandika.
At the marvelous point in your lecture, in which you bring us to the focal point of intersubjectivity, which leads to your marvelous story. You note between the climax and the story, the narrative line, a conundrum that you now face, because conceptually you cannot move forward in terms of working through with a contemporary vocabulary the issues of intersubjectivity.
Right.
I wonder if at this point Freud serves you well, rather than the post-Freudians like the intersubjectivists, or the Confucians, and many others who would focus on self-objects and intersubjectivity and theorize about it in very precise terms.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where the whole thing is going. I mean, this is very much a project that is in process, right? And incomplete in that sense, because I need to move forward. I see Freud as having an intersubjective conception of the subject in Nietzsche, but it's not there. But it's not articulated. It's not flowing out, and that's exactly why one needs to I think move beyond Freud, with Freud and beyond Freud, in order to think about the different ways in which relationality has been articulated, and a relationality that isn't always in danger of it turning into a kind of psychic solipsism, which it certainly is in Freud. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thanks very much.
I will thank Professor Hollywood once again and invite everyone, please, to join us in the Brown Room for a reception. Thank you.